The testimony of Adam. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth, and the beasts of the field, and the fowl of the air, and all creatures that pass through the depths of the sea. And I remember my first day in vivid detail, especially the sensation of my first breath. In that moment, when I first opened my eyes, it was God's eyes looking into my eyes. It was His hand upon my face. I am man one, the first of mankind, the Adam, made from the soils of earth, by the fingers of God, and made alive by the exhaling of the life-giving force of the Spirit of God. So come closer and listen closely to my story, children, because many will neither know nor believe except they hear. And I felt the Spirit of the life-giving force of God, His breath pouring out from my lungs, out of my nose, and I gained instant consciousness. It was a great shock, but not painful. And as I lay there, taking in the sensation of being alive, I remember Him speaking to beings that I only now realize were standing by. And God said, "This is man. Behold, this is good. Behold how beautiful is the man I have made." And I heard voices speaking with God, saying that the man He made was the pinnacle, and that now they understood why everything was made, the sun, the moon, the stars, and earth itself, and they wanted to see more of His plans. I could hear the angels singing, marveling and applauding and rejoicing at the sight of me. And I saw other creatures there with different shapes and features unlike mine, unlike man. And I suddenly realized that I was just like God in His very form and likeness. And then He said to me, "Adam, stand up, please." And for the first time, I did. I stood up and realized that I wasn't meant to crawl around on the ground. I beheld Him, and He beheld me, and I saw Him, and He saw me, and I saw His face, and I looked into His eyes, and I saw Him smile. My dear children, one day you will know Him and be touched and handled by Him just as He once touched and handled me. That was always His intent, and in the end, so shall it be. But I specifically remember the first time He smiled at me, and so I smiled back at Him. And then I heard Him laugh, and I laughed just like Him. I looked at my hands and my fingers. Perfection, fully functional, pure artistic craftsmanship. I looked at my legs and my feet. Perfect. I was suddenly self-aware and fully realized what God had done. I knew instantly that I came from the earth itself and stood there speechless, marveling. That's when He pulled me close and gave me a big hug. he was still laughing. It was like a proud father lovingly embracing his favorite child. And I gave him a hug back, and I laughed too. I gasped with delight at the blazing life flowing from him to me when he hugged me. Then he took me to a special place, a garden planted and arranged by God. It was a garden unlike anything you've ever seen. You see, the things in the garden in Eden were more unique and amazing than anything on the outside. I wish you all could see it, and one day you will. That's why he saved it. And whenever he came to the garden, it seemed like everything was right and pure and perfect in the world. I remember what it was like to stand next to him. I wanted to be so much like him. In my innocence and ignorance, I beheld God and saw him up close. Nothing compares to being close to him. He would speak to the earth, and rivers would spring forth. He could speak to a valley, and a mountain would rise just like the sun rising in the sky. So I imitated what he did, for he was the only example I had. One day I heard him command things in the garden to move out of the way so that I could have a better view at something he wanted me to see. The next morning, before he returned, I spoke to a mountain on the east side of the garden and made an open plain where once stood a great mountain. Not even the angels or other beings that would visit me there had more say in the garden than I. Whatever God did, I did. Later on, I saw him speaking to a green bush, telling it how lovely were its flowers. I stood there and watched as tiny pink and white flowers began to cover the bush. So I did the same thing, and God shook his head approvingly. Then he told me to do it again, and this time in my mind see the flowers as purple on long green stems. I did, and up sprang the most beautiful flowers, just as I had imagined them. The father was so proud. I heard him tell someone that I could not see that he knew I could do it. Pleasing him meant so much to me. But I remember one day, he took me by my hand and led me to a small pond full of floating lilies and other beautiful plants. Then he gently pushed some of the beautiful plants aside and pointed down and said, "Look here. Tell me what you see, Adam." And I looked down, and I found myself looking back at me. And I saw my reflection, and I only knew it was me because I saw his reflection right next to mine, and he was looking at me. All I could say was, "Father, I see us." I can still hear the smile in his voice as he said, "That's right, son." Then, without getting wet, he walked across the pond, pointing to something he wanted to show me on the other side. I followed after him, doing what he did, imitating him like a duckling follows and imitates its mother. That's when I realized again that we were never really alone. My dear little children, God had thousands attending him, but they all waited out of the way and were watching us closely. It seemed like they admired the relationship I had with him. He would ask me to name this or that, and whatever I called it, that is what it has been called ever since. The Father gave me all kinds of fruit to eat and flowers to smell and name. Then he showed me all types of trees and plants, some to eat the fruit of, and others to watch as they grew flowers or changed colors in the wind. It was so fascinating, trees changing color when the wind blew. Then he showed me the tree of knowledge, good and evil, and he showed me the tree of life, and he showed me many other marvelous trees, including some that took 1,000 years to grow. You've never seen a waterfall like those that God had put in the Garden of Eden. Nothing exists like it on the earth. There was the bright orange grass section and the pink purplish grass section, for not all the grass was green. In fact, only the western section of the garden had all green grass. And I loved it there. I saw all kinds of creatures there. Some you think are fantasy and imaginary, but they were actually living in the garden. Some of the animals and plants in the garden were more amazing than anything you've ever seen, for it was a special garden. I saw some animals that I thought were plants until they pulled up their roots and shuffled to another spot in the garden. It took me a minute to figure it out, but the flowers grew on top of shells, and the animals would tunnel underground, leaving the plants planted when they climbed out of the shell. I also saw a bird that would camouflage itself like a flower, but they would fly under the tree branch and float along as if gravity had no effect on them. They were simply amazing. And you should see the garden at night. There was a whole section of fluorescence. When the sun set, the fluorescence would light up. The bioluminescence of the plants and flowers, wow. On a moonless night, when the sky was cloudy and overcast, you should see the blue mist tree. It was beautiful and very romantic. The angels would come to the garden too. Some would even help me. Some liked me a lot. Some did not. Some only came when God came. And I could tell that God loved it there too. And I could tell that he loved talking to me. So one day I asked him, Father, where do you go when you leave me in the evening? I mean, where do you sleep at night? And he laughed and brushed his hands through my hair and said, I'll explain that to you later. You will see. One day I picked a bunch of flowers, and when he came to the garden, I proudly gave them to him. He looked at them and smiled, and they became very thoughtful. It was the same look he had the first time I asked him where my she was. For after a while, I realized that each animal had a mate, a male and female, the pair, and they reproduced. But me? It seemed that something was missing. So when I asked him about it, he had that reflective look in his eyes. I think he waited until I realized that I didn't have a she. And he was waiting until I realized that I needed a she. I needed a mate. He waited for me to understand my emptiness. He stood there for a moment, looking down at the flowers. Then he smiled and gave the flowers back to me. That's when he said, Adam, something is missing. Well, actually, your someone special is missing. Someone especially made as your mate, your soulmate, your life mate. Adam, you need a she. And she is going to rock your world. Are you ready to meet her? Father's house. In my Father's house. In my Father's house.